Welcome to part 2. Shapes and lines might seem simple, but they're the foundation of everything that you're going to create in this design software. This lesson is required reading. Do not skip this one. Let's get in there and get started. All right, let's get into some of those shapes and lines and building blocks. I'm going to make a new file, and we're going to just start with some shapes. If you want to create a section or frame here, you can. I am going to start a frame by pressing F. Then I'm actually going to pick one of the preset frames that Figma gives me over here. In this case, a 14-inch MacBook Pro sounds good. Now to start creating shapes inside of this frame, I can go down to the menu and I can choose what kind of shape I want, but you can see there's keyboard shortcuts too. L for line, R for rectangle, O for ellipse. So let's practice some of those. I'm going to hit R on my keyboard and just draw out a rectangle. And then I'm going to hit O and draw out a circle. Now, these aren't a perfect square and aren't a perfect circle. So let's talk about that. First, I'll hit R again to start a rectangle. But as I'm clicking and dragging, if I hold down Shift, it'll lock the aspect ratio. So I've got some better control there. Or if I'm holding, I let go of Shift there. If I hold down Option, I'm transforming it from the center instead of the top left corner. So if I want to center, or if I want to hold down Shift and lock the aspect ratio, and you better believe you can do Option and Shift at the same time and get yourself a center and an aspect ratio. So that's a quick way to generate, boom, a perfect circle, a perfect square, and have our shapes. Lines are pretty simple too. I'll hit L on the keyboard and then simply start drawing a line. And just like before, you kind of have freeform control over where your line is, but if you hold down Shift, you get locked to 45-degree angles, so you can make a diagonal or perfectly straight line. And then yes, if I started with a line and held down Option, I get it from the center, and then center and Shift. So I'm creating here shapes and lines, and each of these things has properties that we're going to talk about in the next lesson. But there actually is one more sort of distinct type of object that I think is worth highlighting, and that's type. Almost all interfaces are really made of these few things. So if I hit T on my keyboard, or if I come down to the type tool, there's a couple ways to create my type. The first is simply click, and this is doing point type. So I'm writing here point type. And if I want to lock this in, I can hit Command Enter on my keyboard, and then I have point type here. The second is area type, which is selecting the type tool and dragging a rectangle. And when you do that, you see here, it sort of respects the bounds. Now, if you create one kind of type, you're not limited to that piece going forward. You can actually change what it is inside of the interface. And let's go over here and just show you. I have point type, and then over here in layout, if I want to select auto height, or in this case fixed size will automatically give me that area type, but it's exactly the size here. And the same thing, if this is really big, I can say auto height, and that kind of snaps it up. Or if I want to do a point type, then it makes it all in one line. You can also do point type and simply start dragging its corner and force it into a box. Same thing, area type, hitting auto wide, and you get something. Now this looks all pretty gnarly, and yes, there's a ton of type tools if you want to do some typesetting inside of your design software. You can see there's a typography panel where you can choose fonts and sizes and dial everything in, but that's what we're going to be talking about in the properties lesson next. Before we end on shapes, I want to show you something that I think is really important in terms of how you build shapes and place them inside of your frames or on your canvas. I'm going to create a new frame over here by hitting F, just making a rectangle. And then I'm going to place a circle inside of it. And I want that circle to be perfect. I'm holding down Shift. Well, you'll notice over here, in our sort of inspector where all of our properties live, and we're going to get into properties next, I have a position. And that position is relative to the frame that this shape is in. So if you can see, I move this shape up to the top left, and then you can see the design software sort of snapping so that it's right there. That's at 0, 0. It can't go any higher and it can't go any more to the left because that is where our frame limit is. If you try and go beyond that, you actually see it gets cut off, and that's what the frame is doing for us. Now, if we wanted to position this in a different way, we can type in our position, we can move it with our mouse, we can say 50, tab 50, and position it that way. So that's exactly 50 points left and right. And of course, we have alignment controls. You're probably familiar with these in like Google software, where you can center, left, right. And so center is really helpful as well. Using these alignment tools also affects the constraints of the object. So here, when I said center, I've got center for my both horizontal and vertical properties. If I said left, you can see here left and center. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because of resizing and moving our frames. I'll show you a bit how this works. Let's take this frame and I'm going to create a copy of it. And I did that by holding down the Option key and just dragging the name of the frame. And I'm going to put this here. And I'm going to change its constraints to scale and scale. So you can think of this as your typical stretching and squashing that you might see in other places. As you move and stretch the frame, the object inside moves and stretches with it. Hit Command Z and undo. Well, now let's set a different constraint. And you can use this interface here to say left and top. So now when the frame resizes, instead what you're getting is that locking its position to the left and the top. Now let's try to center. Now it's locked to the center, but it isn't centered. So it's going to do its best to sort of shift around and treat it as centered. So where your object is positioned, how you align it, all of these things create different constraints and different rules as to how it's going to behave when it's moved around or resized. And as we start getting into properties and aligning things and building layouts, you're really going to want to understand how your objects are positioned, if there's any problems or gaps with them, and getting them all lined up together. Okay, now you're ready to talk about properties. Let's move on.